So thank you very much for taking a few minutes to chat with us today. Tell me a little bit about your area of expertise, what you focus your research and your study on.
For sure, yeah. So here I do a lot of clinical work with youth and families, a lot of people who come in for inpatient services, day treatment services, anything that kind of outpatient services across the gamut, but really people who are looking for help, often trying to deal with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, social stressors, things of that nature too, how to cope more effectively, how to communicate more effectively with each other, things of that nature too.
Got it. What age group are you working with?
I work with, it can really vary, but really between 5 and 18 primarily. So, yeah.
Okay. Boy, when you think about a 5-year-old coming in with anxiety and or depression or something like that, and a mental illness, a lot of people probably don't think about that. Right? You know, a 5-year-old. So how can a 5-year-old have anxiety and depression? They're 5.
Yeah, that's true, right? I think of those things as you start kind of going through the development stages of kind of self-reflection and awareness of your environment and in those pieces as well. There can be those social comparisons happening at those younger ages too. Some of it is really novel. If they're just getting into school, right, and kindergarten starting, right, they may not have been aware of how kids might do things differently and how they may be operating, or this kid's got this ability and I don't. And so I've even had some 5-year-olds, like where I worked with them, and they were recognizing like, this kid can run faster than me and I can't. And they started feeling, what looked like almost self-esteem kind of areas, right? And it's something you wouldn't even think about. I think it shocks a lot of people at that point. But so I think one thing to watch for, I think with younger kids too, is they might be not coming to you and saying, hey, I'm anxious, and coming to you that way. They might be just noticing things like that differently and just kind of being where their behavior gets different, they get quieter about that, or that they'll have those kind of comparisons and kind of talk negatively. And so it's something just to kind of be aware of and support them on and help them see that, understand that that's okay and we can feel how we want to feel, so it's appropriate to be sharing those feelings and talking about them, and that we're here to be there to support them through it as well too.
I imagine that a conversation with a 5-year-old is a lot different than a conversation with a 17-year-old.
Yes, very much so.
With respect to anxiety or depression. Tell me a little bit about that dichotomy.
For sure, yeah. When they're younger at that point, you've got to meet them where they're at. I mean, some of it's going to be where when they're younger, sometimes they'll talk about their interests more. They may not talk about the subject matter or the idea of anxiety or depression, right? And so you're talking about how you're feeling. And even at the beginning parts, maybe you're just building self-awareness for the younger kid, right? How's my body feel, right, when this is going on and this situation happens, right? What am I noticing? Where are my thoughts even at? And maybe even just how do I react? Maybe with younger kids, you're looking at more behaviors, and then maybe you're getting more cognitive or into thoughts for older kids too. So maybe when you're working with younger kids, you're understanding about how they're acting and how they're feeling through what's their sensations in their bodies, what behaviors are they doing that are different, and then we kind of address it from that capacity. Other kids might be internalizing it more as they get older. And when they're internalizing it, there may not be those clear outward signs, but getting them just to kind of open up and share that information of what's going on, and then having them articulate the thoughts that might be driving the behavior. So that's definitely a difference I noticed there, is sometimes there's not going to be that same insight, and you're developing that insight, and at least openness to kind of communicate younger on, and then that can build on to those older years, but there might be some more self-reflection that's happening, things that they can contribute, like, oh, I'm aware of this, or I'm aware of this and not sure what to do from there as well too.
Yeah, very interesting. So we're talking with you now just a couple weeks out from when most kids will be going back to school here in Utah. Do you see maybe an uptick in the amount of calls or patients that you see around this time of the year and maybe the couple weeks after school starts as kids get back to school, peer pressure, anxiety, things like that?
For sure. No, that's a good point you're bringing up there. Sometimes in the summertime there's a little bit of a lull because the hope is like the summer vacation will get us through it, or that kind of distraction, or I don't have the additional pressure of the obligation of the schoolwork, or this dynamic with a bully or a peer dynamic at school, or this kind of teacher, or this obligation, right? Obligations can sometimes decrease a bit more. There's a bit more flexibility, so the pressure goes down. You're now adjusting to not just in terms of now those more pressures, but even just the structure kind of goes up naturally, right? And so when the structure kind of goes up, there goes expectations as well too. Can I meet those? Pressure that comes from not being met in that way. And obviously, like, there's a lot of assessments, a lot of like, where do you stand at the front of the school year? And so kids are doing a lot of self-referencing and being like, am I keeping up with him or her, or that area as well too? So definitely notice an uptick. from kids with not just in terms of mental health symptoms, but even just kind of even suicidal thoughts or other kind of concerns as well too.
I don't want you to get into any sort of patient specifics, but what are the things that people are bringing up right now that they're anxious about?
For sure. I think let's see, things that they're anxious about. Things that they're anxious about will include areas of that, how am I going to go fit in with either this new class, new school, maybe they've moved and so they're kind of starting over that way too. Maybe they've had bad school experiences and so I'm trying to go for that fresh start. It gets really exciting on the front end, right? But then once they get into that setting, they realize, okay, maybe some of these same problems are still there even though it is a fresh setting. Mm-hmm. Some people are worried about, they're kind of looking ahead to saying, what kind of like extracurricular activities I'm going to do? Am I going to be able to perform and do that or not? These kind of unfair comparisons, ideas of like, these kids have done, soccer for so many years and now I'm trying to join the soccer team because I want to be part of a group and build some friendships, but don't feel as talented, and then kind of being hard on themselves that way too. Mm-hmm. Just even getting back to a normal school rhythm too. Kids who have kind of gone to bed more loose hours or gotten up or other pieces too, and now you have to follow a more strict kind of wake up schedule, transitions in those areas too. And so I think there's a lot of issues that kind of come from that, and then it leads to resistance there, tension on the parents' part, tension on the kids' part. Communication shuts down, and then that can kind of breed more and more issues on that as well too.
A lot of parents will watch this and they may recognize a symptom in their child and that maybe there's some anxiousness or something like that. Does anxiousness automatically lead to or mean they'll be depressed or maybe something further on down the road? Or not necessarily? Not
necessarily. Sometimes it can be. I mean, I think what we kind of talk about is every emotion's functional. Every emotion has its value, is important, right? If I'm anxious, I'm more detail-oriented, so there's a certain amount of functionality to it. So I think with any kind of emotions that the child is experiencing, I look and say, what's their functioning like at this point? Is this emotion impairing the functioning or not, right? And so if they're having that anxiety, could lead to depression or anxiety disorder, could lead to other things as well too. But I think the concern that we're looking at is really how does it impact their functioning? Are they really kind of also communicating about what's going on with that emotion? We find the power of the emotion really kind of skyrockets when it's not being communicated. That's why therapy is so effective, is because when it's externalized, it isn't growing like a parasite in the brain and then feeding into that and then maybe becoming more maladaptive or becoming more of like maybe in the disordered category of things. And so
sure. I know that we're not going to dive a ton into social media, but social media is probably a big component of people's mental health right now these days, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think social media, I mean, even just phone use as a whole, right, that people are using that because they're using that, it's ripe for social comparison. It also has opportunities where people are also maybe engaging with people in ways that are not as adaptive. Sometimes people are looking at that and saying like, okay, therefore I'm not like reaching this objective or things there too, or people are also just using it to really just kind of be more passive in life and not really active and engaged in things that really have a lot of meaning to them. I kind of talk about even like it's the scrolling kind of aspect of it where you scroll through it and people say they're coping while they're going through it, but really they're not actively engaging in the world around them to allow them to be mindful, to allow them to kind of really feel like they're connecting with their life worth living.
They're doom scrolling.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything to be said for the fact that, the population that you mostly work with, this 5 to 17, 18-year-old, is it safe to say that their brain isn't fully developed yet, where maybe like an adult brain is fully developed yet? And as they go to school, they've got all these different things being thrown at them. Is an undeveloped brain more difficult to work with and treat? Is it different in other ways than a fully developed adult brain would be, when we're talking about these things?
For sure. No, definitely. I mean, personality is still developing very much in those years. And so identity, that's like the crux of the identity formation, right? I mean, we're always identity throughout the lifespan happens, but in that crux especially, like you're formulating those different areas. And so definitely when you're treating things, in mind, there's so much dynamic things happening and process there. So you have to kind of really be patient in meeting where you're at, realize that there is going to be a lot of novelty coming in. It's like a lot of data coming in and not knowing how to sort through it. And so, and they're inundated a lot with that, and that kind of relates to, yes, school environment, social media, all those things. We have a lot more data, which is exciting, but then how do we put it all together? And you're right, in terms of how the brain's developing at that point, we're still figuring out what that looks like for ourselves, right? And so those training wheels are still kind of being worked out and happening. And that's why we say communication is so important. It sounds so obvious, but the opportunity to say non-judgmentally, let's explore those different data pieces together and help you kind of figure out how you're going to put it together, because you don't have this framework to like lean on or reference on as well.
So what do we tell parents if they start to see some of these things in their children as they go back to school? Maybe they've never seen it before. Maybe they have seen it before, never said anything, over the last few years. What are a few things that we can tell parents if they start to see some of these things as kids go back to school?
For sure. I think if we see these things, biggest thing I hear from a lot of these kids is I think they worry about like overreaction to things. They worry that, okay, now it's going to mean like, okay, it's going to have to mean I have to have all these intense talks all the time. I'm going to be grilled about this or that. And so that's a big one, I think, makes it where a lot of children will be hesitant to bring that up, because they like, I want to make sure I can do these things. I want to be able to have these freedoms as well. And so I always tell parents to make sure that they are providing an outlet to discuss on things. We don't necessarily have to jump to like, okay, therefore, like this major change has to happen. Let's understand. I want to be able to be understand your experience first before we intervene. Because I think we get all excited to problem solve and intervene. So really, I think recommended parents to take that area to really carve out check-in times throughout the time. Like I kind of joke about like, don't wait till your spidey sense is tingling and then kind of respond, because at that point like we may be off or maybe it's too late. Like it's nice to be able to say, let's have multiple data points, touch points, kind of check in, understand what highlight are you dealing with, what challenge are you dealing with, where are your emotions at? Let's talk about, you're probably experiencing multiple emotions. Let's talk about all of them. And so facilitating open kind of conversation is the biggest part. And then the other thing I recommend parents on is, instead of just jumping to the problem solving, really focus on validation, understanding kind of comments. Help me understand what's going on with you. I can imagine how that's frustrating when that's going on based on that context too. And that really just breeds in continued communication, because it isn't just like a one-stop shop that we're going to be able to do this, or just because they work through that one stressor doesn't mean another one might pop up later too. And so now you've created kind of now a medium where we can be able to discuss things together and really kind of attack these things as they go along, because there might be some problems on the start of the school year, and then maybe they make a connection with a peer and feel all right, and then everything's hunky-dory, but then later on something might come up and they feel like, well, we've already addressed it there, we can't bring it up again. So that open kind of framework that this is an ongoing thing, and it's not going to be bad if this happens or good if this happens, but we're going to just face it together.
These kids spend probably more time at school and in extracurricular activities than maybe they do at home once the school year starts up. Is it incumbent upon teachers, administrators, other stakeholders that are spending a lot of time with these kids to speak up if they say something, or if they see something, maybe a change or something like that, to let someone know that maybe I'm seeing a little bit of a change here?
I think that's great. I always, people talk about taking a village in those areas well too, and I think, again, people are going to be different with different people and different environments. We work here a lot with treatment teams, and so we really believe in the idea of a network. We all come from different disciplines and angles, and we can all get like a different area to be able to contribute. And I think that's the same when it comes to the community as well too.
Right.
So whether it's, people have, teachers, coaches, spiritual leaders, a lot of different areas that they can kind of tap into. And the idea is just kind of but I think the mindset is like support, right? How can we make sure like what level of support the person needs? Are they kind of sharing something in that context that's like going to be helpful for us to know how to intervene with their greater environment?
So we talked a lot about warning signs, some things that people can do to try to intervene or step in and help out. But on the flip side of things, as these kids are going back to school, you being so ingrained in this field, what keeps you up at night? What worries you as these kids are heading back to school in today's day and age?
For sure. I think what worries me, really honestly, is the internalizing of problems. I think that, and sometimes the judgment that there is something wrong with me. A common area of like, I'm not good enough, right? So that's the idea, and not communicating. So what keeps me up at night is the idea like, if we're talking about it, if they've got a network of people in to help check and communicate those things too, we can do something about it. It's, I always think about like all the people that walk in the door that I treat, and then I think of all the people that haven't been walking through doors, whether it's our clinic or other clinics or places like that too, right? And I think that's the part of just things kind of getting ignored, assumptions, that kind of keeps me up at night as well too, that people kind of operate off the assumption. If we're not talking about anything, everything's okay. And the reality is it's this kind of unspoken thing that just grows underneath like a parasite that way. And if we aren't talking about it, it just keeps growing as well too. Yeah. So that's the part that I feel like is if people are talking about those things, if people can see that they're not going to be judged and it's not going to reinforce this idea of being not good enough or that nobody cares, I'm just alone in this. That's such a powerful thing, by the way, too, is kids knowing that they're not alone in this. And so the ones that just kind of just feed that narrative into their mind and don't have any external things to kind of challenge that viewpoint, that's the part where I feel like, worries me. And that's the part that I just, with the awareness part that I appreciate it's been growing on it, it's just like, there can be a table that we can talk about with this, and we don't have to judge it, and we can treat it just like anything else.
To that point, while it may not be perfect right now, do you feel like there's been more resources brought to the table statewide from lawmakers, from school districts, to try to help these kids out deal with some of these issues in your time in this industry? Do you feel like that's gotten better here in Utah? For sure, yes. And over the kind of the 10 years that I've seen it, I mean, even here, we've gotten those crisis lines have grown. We have the Safe Utah app that the kids can use to kind of reach out and do that as well. And how like now. Yeah, exactly. So all those different resources. Again, I think people are now recognizing like when situations happen, we bring in mental health support and like what's one of the first steps that people look at now, right? When these crises happen. So yeah, I feel like there's been that. I mean, obviously we're still always growing on that too. And I think that's where, but from what's been there and the gap of meeting that need, the availability of programs out there, I've just seen a lot of growth in that area. In Utah in particular, from all levels of care. So I've seen more and more of those areas kind of keep meeting that need, and then we kind of meet up to the need and keep growing with it. But that just means more people are getting treated, and so in that sense, I sleep better at night, knowing that we're keeping up more with the availability. And while there's still going to always be a demand, and the demand might continue, part of it's because people are talking about it and not just swallowing it or internalizing it or ignoring it. Yeah. Anything else that you think that we missed that's important to talk about or touch on, as these kids are going back to school with respect to their mental health? As they gear up to hit the books. Sure, yeah. No, I think definitely people talk about like, it's like they do their like, physical checkup. I think mental health checkup is going to be an important one. So I think just even starting with like what kind of habits we can do as a family coming in to make sure that we are checking in about what's going on, even as a family system, how our mental health is doing, and not just the individual child themselves. What can our environment really be doing to make sure that we're supporting this change? Because the whole family has to adjust to the start of school, right? And the things that are happening there. So definitely recommend doing those kind of things, recommending that people are, again, checking in, saying how are they feeling about things that they can anticipate coming, or even the unforeseen things that are coming as well too. Just saying like, hey, is there something that we can do, even if we can't predict what's going to be next? How can we make sure we have these checkpoints and keep a pulse on stuff as well? Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time. Yeah, I do appreciate it. Appreciate it.
You may have already touched on this, but so I'll ask it again. Can you point to something, maybe not specific, but that the sudden focus on mental health, like the past few years, suddenly that's just been talked about everywhere, whereas even when I was in school, the rest of us in school, not really, but now it's like, yes, your mental health is important. Why suddenly is that at the forefront?
Yeah. I think why that's more at the forefront is because I think people are recognizing that while it's always been there, it's been something that everybody kind of felt like they just had to figure out for themselves. And I think the idea that there's such more advocacy in general for a lot of different things, I think, in life out there, and that people are really supporting this idea of unique perspectives, people sharing where they're coming from, those elements. Again, the voice needs to be heard. And so I think with that comes along with the mental health piece that, okay, this is something that is a voice that does need to be heard. That also, I think there's more, really, I think there's been research has been kind of exponential as well too. And with the research that's been exponential, people are seeing that this isn't just like, oh, like the blues or somebody who's just, a worrywart or, things that people would describe before as well. They're saying, no, there's actually like, chemical reactions that are driving that. This isn't just something that is a deficit that the person has. They just need to figure out and clean up on themselves. But there's actually like things that we can treat, and there's elements that we can impact them across the board, from therapy, from medications, from across the gamut, and education. So with more education comes more awareness, and so that's been, I think, people have been eager to hear it, I think, too. I think the other reason why it's kind of grown so much is I think people, it's something, again, that hasn't been communicated that people wanted to. It's that validation element that a lot of people can relate to it, whether it met clinical disorder levels or stuff that were just symptoms they had to kind of go through in their past or present, or they have a family member that deals with it. It's kind of like the different iterations of it. You don't get too far along, and you can find somebody who's struggling with that. And so I think all those things are saying that there's a part that's relatable, there's a need for it, and that we're just in a place now where we can be able to talk about it and really face it across a lot of different ways.
Emerging from the pandemic, maybe?
The pandemic, definitely. I think the pandemic part, what we've learned from that is that people kind of realized how important like social engagement was, and how that affects mental health as well too. I mean, people, we've known that from isolation, things like that too, but the idea of how that affected them, or just how people need to kind of be part of not just communities, but how those resources when they're away, how now we're left to our own devices, and how our brain can go a lot of different ways with it. And sometimes there's healthy ways that responds, and sometimes there's ways that are less than healthy. And so I think it really kind of allowed us like that space too to kind of face and see that is a space to face the demons as well too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.